I place the objects to be consecrated by Mass in a bag. I'll often use a backpack if they're fairly small, or if they're large, like a sword, you can use an instrument case, like a guitar case. And you'll bring the case or the bag into the church Mass.
Grab your traveling cloaks, listeners, because today the Glitch Bottle podcast journeys deep into the world of Solomonic bells, wands, and consecrations, oh my, with practicing magician, writer, and Renaissance man, Mr. Adam Pearson, also known as Frater S.C.F.V. Now, Adam is the author of several in-depth and meticulously researched Solomonic Magical articles on his blog, Light in Extension, articles completely dedicated to Solomonic bells, wands, circles, and how to properly consecrate magical items, all subjects that we discuss on the podcast. In fact, the Bells and Trumpets article was published in the 2018 edition of the Hermetic Tablet Journal, which you should definitely check out. Now, Adam was raised as a Roman Catholic in Montreal, where he became fascinated with ritual, and then he went on to study Western philosophy. He became immersed in Quranic Arabic and the Islamic tradition, including Sufism, and he was trained in Zen meditation. Adam was also trained in Bhakti and Advaita Vedanta Jnana Yoga, and was initiated into the Golden Dawn. Even mundanely, the man is always busy, with experience as a teacher, a mentor, a certified chef, and now as a social worker. In this episode, we go deep into Solomonic bells, wands, and an awesome word that Adam coined called consecratio, which I know you listeners will enjoy. So now, to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Mr. Adam Pearson. Adam Pearson, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Your articles are popping up everywhere. So many people are talking about them. There's in-depth scholarly research. There's practical experience you have. There's different techniques of the Solomonic method and tools and all this stuff that hopefully we can get into. But I guess, Adam, for the listeners out there who might not be too familiar with your background and just kind of like how you got interested in esotericism and Solomonic magic, can you just share with the listeners about the genesis of your interest in this?
I was actually raised as a devout Catholic in a nice small town here in Quebec. I grew up kind of immersed in the church environment with the incenses and the robes and the candles burning and the light streaming through the stained glass windows. And I really loved that romantic, almost ceremonial aspect. And I would later come to think that the ceremonial magical tradition and the ordinary exoteric Catholic Church have a great deal in common and a lot of overlap between them as well. So I think my kind of love for mystery and that kind of almost role-playing like environment that later manifested in my love of ceremonial magic was already implanted at that young age. I spent quite a few years until I was 12. I was in Bible study and so on in the Catholic Church. I went through all the sacraments, but I was kind of a strange kid. I was, as Gordon White would probably say, I was wandering around a lot when I was a kid, and I was thinking, I was asking spiritual questions. I was contemplating where everything came from, the origin of things, the nature of ultimate reality. And I didn't have words to describe that except from what I had learned from the church, but I was always trying to contemplate that. And when I was 14, I started reading the works of Plato, and I got into Socrates' questioning method and his approach to not just receive traditions as they're given to you, but interrogate them and question them. And I started to do that with my own Catholic tradition, to look into the history of the church and how the Council of Nicaea emerged. And I was shocked to discover that there were so many competing Christologies that were presenting different views of Jesus in the 2 centuries after the crucifixion. So when that happened, I started to get into a lot of doubt about the Trinity and whether Jesus really was the Son of God. I loved the prophets and the prophetic tradition, and so I started to talk to some Muslim friends. I was lucky to have friends both in the Middle East and here, and we would have a lot of discussions about Islam. I ended up going very deep into that tradition. One of the things I've been very lucky to have had in my life is some great mentors and great communities that I've been deeply immersed in. that have kind of expanded my view into the integrative form that it is today. And part of that was Islam. So when I went deep into Islam, I was studying traditional Quranic Arabic. I was praying in Arabic, memorizing surahs or chapters of the Quran by heart in Arabic. I was going to the mosque and having that great experience of being surrounded by the amazing Muslim community. And it was interesting. There were moments where I would be sitting there with Muslim scholars from Saudi Arabia who taught me to put honey into green tea and eat it with biscottis, and we'd have these really amazing theological discussions. So I really loved the Quran. When I read it, I was just blown away by the beauty and the poetry of the words. I went deep into that tradition. I practiced very devoutly for a few years. And I also was lucky to learn from some Sufi mystics, the mystical branch of Islam, and they taught me how to do dhikr, which is remembrance of God using divine names. So that was my first exposure to the kind of esoteric use of divine names, which would become so prominent in my Solomonic practice later on. So for me, that was so interesting. But I was also always thinking no tradition had a monopoly on truth. You know, as the Golden Dawn neophyte ritual says, I will respect all traditions, for there's not one but contains a ray of that light which I seek. And for me, that was always my viewpoint. So I was lucky to have these non-Muslim friends as well who were Buddhists and were Hindus. And so I didn't confine myself to any one tradition. I was lucky to later on get a Buddhist teacher who taught me Zen Buddhism, and that's where I learned a deep appreciation for meditation and the inner work that is also kind of a prerequisite for going deep into Solomonic ritual, because when you're entering an altered state of consciousness, you have to have great control and centeredness and concentration in the mind, and that is deeply cultivated by meditation. But I was also lucky to learn from some Hindu gurus. I had two traditions that I worked with, Advaita Vedanta, the Nondual Vedanta tradition, and Kashmir Shaivism. I was given Shaktipat Diksha, which is an initiation by energetic transmission into Kashmir Shaivism. There I was really stunned by the Bhagavad Gita's approach to union with the divine and this yogic tradition, which I found had so many interesting overlaps with everything I had been doing before. I started to think that Christianity was a form of bhakti yoga. It was a form of devotional yoga to the divine. And there was also the jnana yoga, the deep, direct knowledge approach to realizing the nature of the ultimate reality. And then there was karma yoga, which is about service and connecting with the divine through that, which overlapped with the kind of practical work I was doing as a teacher, a coach, a life coach, and later on as a social worker now, which I'm getting into. All of these rich traditions were kind of informing and coming together and filling my mind with doubts and wonderful questions and a great deal of curiosity. At the same time, I went to study liberal arts and kind of got an overview of the Western philosophical tradition from the ancient to the 21st century. That really was filling more questions and raising interesting arguments that I was kind of grappling with as I was doing all this religious stuff on the side. It was very interesting, and I'm this strange melting pot of these different traditions that have blended together. I was always interested in magic from the time I was 14. I later got initiated into the Golden Dawn and studied that tradition for many years. Later got into the Solomonic work by approaching the grimoires and diving deep into that. In my mind, it's very integrative. All these different traditions, I just see connecting links between them, and they're not at war. There's a great harmony, Tiferetic harmony of the Sephirah of Tiferet, we might say, in Kabbalistic terms, that unifies each tradition. So I like to look at the different languages that they use and the different images they use and the techniques that are often very universal, as Dr. Stephen Skinner has shown in his works. For me, that's the great adventure of the great work.
You immersed yourself in this menagerie of different world religions, experiences, esotericism. Did you find in that kind of inner harmony that the technique was kind of more global as opposed to being this very isolated thing? Did you also see that in terms of the actual like magical and esoteric techniques as well?
Absolutely. There's a ton of overlap between the different traditions. And I'm not a spokesperson for all of these traditions. I can speak to my own experience, and others are free to disagree with me. But definitely in the Solomonic tradition, we have this continuous legacy of the use of certain traditional techniques. And Dr. Skinner has really done an amazing job of drawing those connections between the Greek world and the Egyptian world through the Hellenistic period, into the PGM, into the Byzantine period and the Hygromantia, down to our Key of Solomon and our other Solomonic grimoires. And there is a great deal of continuity. With the wand, for example, we have wands all over the world. There are African wands we can talk about. There are these ancient Greek wands, which were often either a piece of myrtle or a serpent-shaped wand. We found serpent-shaped wands in the graves of Egyptian magicians from the dynastic period. We have French baguettes. We have Islamic wands in the jinn magical systems, which also tend to be very Solomonic. In fact, there's a whole tradition around King Suleiman or Solomon in the Islamic lore. And all of these traditions are extremely overlapping. There's so many magic circle approaches all around the world. And there's a lot of commonality, which, depending on your interpretive framework, some people have interpreted that as coming out of human evolution, deriving the same kind of archetypical structures, which then were produced and acted out and embodied in these tools. But if you're from a spirit model perspective, you might say that how else could you explain this tremendous overlap of worldwide techniques unless the spirits themselves were teaching and guiding us to craft and improve these methods? And I think there's a combination of those two. I like that integrative approach. I think they both have a partial truth, but there's definitely this universality to the core magical structures of the world.
Adam, too, to that point, I'm wondering, do you agree with Skinner when I think it was in both the techniques of Greco-Egyptian magic and also Solomonic magic books, he kind of lays out this spectrum where on one side you have religion, where it's public and people gather en masse to worship. It's more of a petitioning of the gods. It's done, by a priest in a giant temple area. And then on the way opposite side of the spectrum, you have, cloistered individual magical practice. It's done under the cloak of secrecy. There's usually one client. And instead of petitioning a god or gods or spirits, you are using, materia magica and other things to constrain them, bind them, or use some kind of divine name to get them to do something. And then in the middle of this spectrum, between these two, you have this mystery tradition that apparently is lost in the West, or at least it's obscured somehow, and that this mystery tradition isn't religion and it's not magic, but it's more about the ascent of consciousness to connect with the infinity of whatever God you're dealing with. Like, I just remember reading that and I was like, wow, there's this global kind of tradition, but there seems to be these different segments. Can you just kind of talk about that a little bit? Do you kind of see it that way as well, or what are your thoughts on that?
I love that section. I was reading that the other day in Techniques of Greco-Egyptian Magic. And for me, it's very difficult to draw firm lines between those three dimensions. I think that Dr. Skinner is very clear in explaining that this is a continuum, and it's helpful to be technologically and terminologically precise about the different words. But in my experience, it has all kind of been quite blended together along the journey of my life. Within Islam, for example, there's a lot of stigma against the use of magic because magic was associated with deception and with the use of spirits that were assumed to be against God, these shaitan or these demonic entities. And so there was a lot of skepticism about that. And there was a lot of Solomonic tradition type constraining of those spirits in their tradition. And that's very magical in the sense that Dr. Skinner uses. There's also the dimension of the mysteries in Islam. There's the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, which was very much an immersion and ascension through the different heavens and speaking with different prophets for him as he underwent that journey. There's the whole religious aspect, which does often happen in public, but there's private devotion as well, and that's very much an individual component of the religious path. And the magical aspect definitely does seem to involve making things happen in the world. I like to combine different magical definitions of what magic is. I don't have a beautiful, comprehensive definition of that, but at this point I'm kind of playing with magic is the art and science of influencing change using the agency of spirits or energies or occult virtues of objects. That seems to be what I've arrived at. So when I talk about magic, that's generally what I mean. But I also am deep into the theurgical traditions where magic becomes an interface for mystical union and realization of eternal unity. If you look at the word religion itself, religio, it's to connect together, it's to bind together. It's, in that sense, it's very much like the mysteries. There's a unity, there's a realization of oneness with a deity. And it's also the sense of binding is, essential to the Solomonic magical method. So for me, there's a lot of interesting overlaps. It's helpful to make these distinctions because we can then say this text is more religious than magical, or it's more of a mystery text than a magical text. So that is partially true, but it's also true that there's a lot of continuum and overlap, and there's magical elements within religious practice sometimes, as in, I would say, the transubstantiation of the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ. That is a very magical and alchemical act for me. And as we'll talk about probably later, in the consecration by Mass, that is a fundamental magical technique using religious technology. And there's a lot of overlap that's really fun to play with. But I think Dr. Skinner's definition is really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate your definition as well, Adam. And it reminds me of something, and I'd love your thoughts on this. Aaron Leach in Secrets of the Magical Grimoires has this whole chapter on theurgy, which he talks about as being the heart of the work. And he talks about angelic workings, angelic interfacing. Does that kind of approach what you're referencing in terms of, yes, you can use magic for certain material ends or certain other things you can, devote yourself, like, the Liber Iuris is a very, very devotional kind of Catholic grimoire. But then there's this just interface of angelic work and working with spirits for, as you say, kind of the elevation of consciousness. Does that, and the things that Aaron kind of talks about, approach also what you're discussing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both of those aspects are part of my own work. They're not necessarily always aligned. Thaumaturgy and theurgy don't always go together worldwide. If we look at the magical practices of different traditions, some practices are extremely thaumaturgic and very much practical results oriented. And I love Jason Miller's work around magic. My definition is very much influenced by his view that magic is influencing the probabilities of events occurring, but not necessarily causing it if those are very improbable results that we're trying to aim for. So there can be this very concrete, practically oriented, let's do love magic, let's do wealth magic, let's do these things that are going to produce concrete results in the world for an individual. And that could be, there's a sociological role to that often in many of the traditions, where the magician is working on behalf of a community. And there's a service to that community in the cunning folk traditions, for example, or a lot of the folk magical traditions. That's very much part of it. That's very concrete. It's very practical oriented, serving the people almost in a shamanic way, as Aaron Leach beautifully illustrates in Secrets of the Magical Grimoires as well. But there's also this theurgic dimension, which is so interesting. And for me, as someone who was trained in Zen Buddhism and who came through deep mystical work and contemplative work, that's always been very interesting for me too, because there is a depth to it, to the realization of our ultimate nature, we might say. And that very much could be a part of magic. I think Dr. Skinner would say that's more on the mystery side of things. But in the Golden Dawn system, for example, that mystery dimension is there through all the grade rituals. But there's also the practical side. And there's also the theurgical side of realizing your divine nature as going through these different stages and these different realizations. So for me in my own work, and I mainly work with archangels, so for me, I'm not as much interested in thaumaturgy. I do use it sometimes, but always through the agency of spirits when I do go that route. The realization of the divine mysteries and asking angels about what they have to share about different aspects that fall within their specialty is very interesting for me. And that's kind of a philosophical approach to magic, which is very much present in Agrippa. He very much saw philosophy and magic as unified, as this kind of singularity of spiritual practice and theurgical investment that was also linked to the practical work that people were doing. And I think for me that was a very big part of what I do as well. So I would agree with Aaron on that.
I've had people who practice, say, the Vajrayana Buddhist path or other paths, let's say, Zen Buddhism, in discussions saying, well, what is all this magic stuff, this Western grimoire stuff? This is samsara. This is the cycle of death and rebirth. You're using, materia magica to either constrain spirits or even inviting angels. This is still, if there's any material gain or even the acquisition of knowledge, is anathema in a way to simply turning within, forgetting all that magic stuff, and just practicing the path, the kind of orthodox path of, say, Vajrayana or other paths. And so I guess you'd be great to ask this because you have a lot of this experience, and yet there is this deep interest in Solomonic ritual, in the proper consecration of things. So it seems like a false dichotomy, or it seems like a dichotomy. Like there's enlightenment and realization on one side, and then there's material-bound magical grimoire practice on the other side. Can you just share with our listeners, Adam, like, for someone with your experience, how do you reconcile these seemingly two opposite things, or just how do you navigate those waters?
Yeah, for me, I tend to be very in favor of non-dual approaches that break down dichotomies and break down these absolute dividing lines that are said to be between anything that we want to talk about. In many of these traditions, like Advaita Vedanta, one of the deeper realizations is that there is no separation. In terms of relative experience of phenomenology and how things appear in our consciousness, things appear to be distinct and to be distinguishable from one another, but in their ultimate nature, there are no distinctions between us, between practical things, between the divine. It's all not two, as we would say in Advaita. So for me, that aspect is very interesting, and it applies to magic as well. That's why I don't really see that kind of radical division point there, because for me, magic can be an extension of yoga. We can use what we realize in magic to help us in yoga. We could use what we learn in yoga to help us in magic. There's a continuity of wisdom as it expresses in these different domains. And for example, the Eastern traditions, in Vajrayana, when magic is used, they have practical reasons to do it. It could be to help the community. It could be to assist somebody, to heal somebody. But it's also used as a tool in the Buddhist practice to work towards nirvana and liberation. And in that case, one can be invoking the wisdom of Buddhas that are visualized as appearing within oneself. And this formulation of these different mansions that the different spirits inhabit within oneself, and seeing that unity take place, which provides the spiritual wisdom that then aids the journey of enlightenment. And I think Lon Milo Duquette also talks about this in his approach to the Kabbalah, that it's part of our journey of waking up. And even though we can do practical things, and we will do practical things because we're also human beings, and we have practical aims in the world, we navigate through the world by means of identifying valued outcomes and working towards them. And our emotional system is physiologically tuned to that. So we get these positive emotions when we take an action that moves us towards something we value. And we get these negative emotions when we feel like we're not moving towards a valued outcome, or we're moving towards something that isn't valued. And that's just purely neurophysiological, and it's encoded in our brain. And that is just how the whole, or the universe in its totality and its oneness, plays out as instantiated within human beings pursuing practical ends. So for me, there's really no ultimate or absolute distinction between these domains. They're part of the same continuum. They're different aspects of the spiritual tradition. Depending on which aspect you're working within, you'll approach it differently. If you're doing Solomonic work and you're consecrating objects, there is a pre-consecrated state and a post-consecrated state. And a consecrated object feels different phenomenologically. It's subjectively. When you pick it up, if a spirit has empowered that object, you'll feel that. It will work differently when it's used in work with spirits. Whereas an object that is just like a stapler that you picked up from your desk, if you try to use that as a wand, it might not work as well. The angels might not be as responding to the power of the stapler,
Well, that's why it's not working for me. I'm using the damn stapler instead of the actual materia magica. Darn it. To that point, Adam, you just mentioned the pre-consecrated state and the post-consecrated state, and I think this would be a great opportunity to talk about an incredible article that you wrote called The Bells and Trumpets of Solomon, Resounding Instruments of the Solomonic Grimoires. And I'd love to kind of take that last point that you made and kind of weave it into this discussion and go deep, so to speak, into this importance of bells, of trumpets, of instruments that are sonorous and that vibrate. And you kind of, in this article, break down a lot of the history, the commonalities, and the differences between different traditions, whether they be Hebrew or the Greek hygromantia, which we'll get into. But I guess, Adam, just as a broad overall question, when it comes to this really cool article that you wrote, what was the inspiration for it? Like, what made you say, I want to write about and really research Solomonic bells and trumpets?
Well, for me, the bell and trumpet traditions are an extremely marginalized aspect of the Solomonic traditions. People love to talk about the circles and the wands and the daggers, and of course, they're so central to the work. If you go to the Key of Solomon or you go to the Hygromantia, there are references to these bells or to trumpets, depending on the manuscript that you're looking at. And those are considered very widely to be core elements of the invocation or the evocation procedures that are given in these grimoires. And I found that there weren't a lot of people who were talking about that in great depth and kind of placing it in the context of ancient Greek practices and the Hebrew traditions around the hatzotra or the trumpet and the shofar or the horn. These were very rich and they had a powerful impact on the grimoires themselves, and they're core instruments that we can use in our work. So I wanted to dive deeply into and kind of provide that context and this comparison between different grimoires that use these tools and kind of explain how we could also use them today in our practical work.
For those listeners out there who might know a little bit about, like what it says about the Hebrew tradition or maybe the Greek tradition, can you, Adam, just kind of break down, like, what are the different strands or strains of sonorous instruments, and how are they separate, but then how do they weave together in some areas?
For sure. So we have these sometimes distinct and sometimes overlapping bell and trumpet traditions that go through many cultures. I mean, we have archaeological evidence of bell-like and horn-like or trumpet-like instruments on nearly every world continent, I think, except for Antarctica. The oldest known Neanderthal bone flute was found at a habitation site in Scandinavia from 82,000 to 43,000 years ago. And shortly after that, the first trumpets and horns emerged, and these were made from animal horns, like the Hebrew shofar, which was later referenced in the biblical traditions. And we also found the earliest archaeological evidence of bells in Yangshao culture in what we would call modern-day China. They date to around 3000 BCE. And so these traditions are extremely old. This is a highly ancient aspect of the magical tradition. And it's also referenced by Agrippa. He talks about the use of a bell to consecrate an object, not only the salt or the water, but bells and their vibrations themselves were held to have this apotropaic or evil influence or evil spirit banishing power. And it's interesting, if you want to understand a technology that's used in a Solomonic grimoire, it's nice to see if there are precedents in the Bible, because often there are. The use of hyssop, for example, is very biblical. It's used in consecration and purification rituals in the Bible. But also the trumpets and the bells, or more specifically bell-like cymbals, are very prominent in the Hebrew tradition. Within the Key of Solomon, we have this trumpet that is said to be used to blow to the four quarters to call the spirits to come to the circle. Originally, this link between the trumpet and King Solomon dates back to 1 Kings 1, verses 31 to 35, where David orders Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet to anoint Solomon king and blow a trumpet, which the specific word is a hatzotra, which is distinct from the horn or the shofar in the Hebrew tradition. And there's so many other traditions around bells and trumpets within the Tanakhic or the Hebrew Bible literature. We can look at, for example, trumpets being blasted to signal God's presence to Moses in Exodus 19, verse 16, or declaring the start of festivals in Leviticus 23, verse 23, or the 7 priests' trumpet blast that topple the walls of Jericho in Joshua 6, verses 4 to 5, or the 7 angels who stand before God blowing the 7 trumpets to signal the different phases of the apocalypse in Revelation 8, verse 2. And there's also the trumpet blasts that are just used to worship God in the Bible. You'll find this, for example, in Psalm 150, which also references using bell-like cymbals for the same purpose. So there's this link between these bell-like cymbals and these trumpets that's there in the tradition. They're used to celebrate God with David and the Israelites in 1 Chronicles, verse 13 and 8, to dedicate the wall of Jerusalem in Nehemiah, or to praise God while builders lay the foundations of Solomon's temple in Ezra 3. So this is very interesting that even there was this deep understanding that bells and trumpets had some kind of spiritual power that could be used by God, or it could be used to praise God or to invoke spiritual powers. And that tradition was a distinct tradition. But in parallel to that, there were also the bell traditions. In ancient Greek, there were the use of campana, or small handbells, to banish evil spirits. And we find that translating into the hygromantia. In the Key of Solomon source text, there's no trumpet of art used, like we'll find later in some of the Key of Solomon manuscripts. But there are two references to trumpets that are to angels' trumpets being sounded to call for the second coming, or by the angel of resurrection. But the tool that's used there instead of a trumpet is a small handbell, or a campanon, that's used to sound the entrance to the circle and to use to call the spirits, in a similar way to what we'll later find with the bells and trumpets in the Key of Solomon.
As opposed to a circle or a wand or anything else, what is it from your research and from your practical experience about this kind of vibrational capacity that these instruments hold in terms of both attracting spirits and honoring them? Like, what is it about things that make noise that really helps accentuate whatever magical operation you are undertaking?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think the way I understand it is that it links to Agrippa's concept of occult virtue, or the hidden nature of things. We know this when we're at a musical concert for our favorite band, for example. There's such a feeling of harmony and powerful, ecstatic celebration that comes over the crowd. And you look at people and they're all just totally transported out of their daily concerns. They're in a different space. And that space is mediated by these vibratory tonalities, whether it's from any kind of music you want to explore, or in the grimoires, it's being used by these consecrated instruments, these bells or these trumpets. And I think they resonate with the nature of the spirits that we're working with. The use of a calling power, it helps to draw them towards. It's kind of like the use of the conjurations. It's like the use of the invocations. It creates this flow of powerful words that the spirit's attracted to. They come into the space of that it creates. They can resonate with that. They can be present with that. And the angels seem to really resonate with the bell tonalities. They're very resplendent, they're harmonious, they're beautiful, in the same nature that the angels have. And so it seems like it creates this resonance. That's a pun, but it's also literal, between the spirit's nature and the sounds or the vibrations that are being created. And I actually think that this tradition of using bells and trumpets running through the Bible, through the grimoires, there's also a parallel tradition in the PGM, or the Greek Magical Papyri, of bellowing words of power, and that droning out these long divine names, or these nomina magica, or kind of using that forceful projection of sound to call the spirits. And I think that goes down into the Golden Dawn tradition through their use of the vibratory formula. I think it's all different manifestations of the same universal magical principle.
Well, that is awesome. And to that point, and in terms of this kind of multifaceted use of the bells, I'm going to quote your article about midway through, where you say, quote, "The exorcisms and benedictions by consecrated water and salt of the art to which Agrippa alludes to are well known to Solomonic magicians. Indeed, instructions for both are presented in chapters 5 and 11 of Book 2 of Joseph Peterson's Key of Solomon, the Clavicula Salomonis. However, the consummate power of bells themselves to exercise and bless sacred spaces within the Solomonic tradition is often neglected. It is no accident that Agrippa lists bells, water, and salt together. For him, as for many other writers in his own time and long before, these ritual items were often considered together and used in complementary ways." And I remember reading that. I never thought of before in terms of the power to literally sanctify a space via something that is literally just auditory vibrations. I mean, can you just talk about this in terms of the power to exercise and bless sacred spaces using bells and sonorous instruments?
Exactly. So that's very present in Agrippa, and that reference, I believe, is from the third book of Occult Philosophy, where he talks about the apotropaic power of bells, salt, and holy water to chase and drive away evil spirits. That's the exact term that he uses. And he also says it has a protective power. It can protect those who are in the area in which they are used. And again, I think this has to link to that, the power of the vibrations to kind of create an empowered space that vibrates at a certain resonance that the spirits can be in harmony with or less in harmony with, depending on their nature. And I think that tradition has been very neglected by a lot of the grimoire magicians, because we tend to focus so much on, at least we have the conjurations and we have the invocations, where we're using the same principle. We're using the power of loud sound to bring the spirits together. There's something about the blowing of a horn which just silences you. It stuns the mind. It has a psychological effect on us, but it has a sympathetic, resonant effect on the spirits too. And it's like when you're in a meditation hall and you hear the meditation bell sound, the mind starts to calm hearing that. Or when you're in a Catholic church and you hear the transubstantiation bells that are played at that moment, where the body and the blood of Christ are produced from wine and from bread. There's that resonance. That resonance kind of echoes the alchemical transformative effect of the ritual that's taking place. And I find the Hindu temples also have these bells that you sound when you go in. This is something that Dr. Skinner told me, that announces your presence to the divinity and also announces the divine to you. And there's this harmony again. There's that unity that we were talking about before. So the bell seems to work in mysterious ways upon human consciousness itself. I think this is related to the power of harmony and beauty, which we have instantiated within music, which is also resonant of the higher nature of beauty and order in the universe that we look out for, and we love that, and we seek it out in science and in spirituality and in our daily lives, reflecting on what's happening to us. We assume there's some meaning to it. And that sense of harmonious, orderly pattern and structure is there, kind of magically instantiated within those vibrations of the bells and horns.
There's a part in the article that you mention, for example, Aaron Leach, quote, took a similar approach and brilliantly resolved the dilemma of whether to side with the bell or trumpet traditions in his own Solomonic work by using a trumpet of art made to the exact specifications of the Key of Solomon, to which he attached 7 bells by 7 ribbons in the 7 planetary colors. Can you just talk about, there might be listeners out there who might say, well, oh my gosh, like, I haven't used a bell before or a trumpet, but do I use the bell? Do I use the trumpet? What do I do? And you mentioned Aaron Leach there, and I guess just what are your thoughts on that and advice to listeners who might be saying, well, how do I get started? What do I do? Which one do I use? All that stuff.
Yeah, so I think if you're sticking to the Key of Solomon, you have an option there. You can use the trumpet, or you can use a bell. Or you can do what Aaron Leach did, and you can use a combination of the two. I think both of those are well established within the original manuscripts. There's a parallel tradition that says use the bell of art, and there's another series of Key of Solomon manuscripts that says use the trumpet of art. And they're used in exactly the same way within the Key of Solomon. They're either blown, or in the case of the trumpet, or sounded in the case of the bell, to the 4 quarters at the beginning of the ritual. So you're kind of calling the spirits from the 4 quarters. And so either one will produce the same effect. I haven't seen any practical difference between one or the other. If you're doing what Aaron did, you can blow the horn while kind of ringing the bells. They're being jingled while you're blowing. And then you have both effects at the same time. But I think if you're just getting started, you can start with either whatever's available to you and experiment, see what the different results are produced by using different implements. For me, the bell is the one that I've found most connects with me and seems to work the best in my own practice. But the trumpet has just as much tradition behind it and works just as well from what I've seen. So what I would recommend is that people who want to get into this kind of tradition, you can review my article, you can look at the grimoires and what they say about preparing the bell or preparing the trumpet. And you can either craft one yourself. I mean, if you're following the Key of Solomon's trumpet tradition, you're supposed to use new wood. So that's often interpreted as virgin wood that hasn't been used before, as in the case of the wand. And it's interesting that the book uses wood for a horn or a trumpet. That's very different from what was going on at the time. You know, there was the Renaissance horns and trumpets were often made from animal horns. We had that also in the Hebrew shofar, but there were also shell horns like the Malton Bronya. made from a conch shell or bronze horns, like the Roman bronze cornu or buccina or a Scandinavian lure. But if you prefer, you could just use a bell. And that could be precisely kind of smelted, or you could commission it to be made, or you can take an older bell or an antique bell. That's what I did in my case. And I exorcised it and consecrated it and blessed it using the methods that are given in the Key of Solomon. And that can produce a similar effect. But again, none of this is absolute truth. I'm not here to tell people what to do. What I recommend is to study the texts, experiment, and see what works the best for you.
To that point about the bells and these sonorous instruments, you were mentioning about the number 7, for example, and just how there is this deep tradition with that number and associating it with sonorous instruments. And I know something we were talking about, and something that's mentioned, for example, in the Liber Iuratus, is the 7-sided whistle that is supposed to be crafted by the operator, and perhaps having the sigils of the different planetary archangels on each side. And can you just talk about your thoughts in terms of whistles, or just how important it is, I guess, in terms of having these sonorous instruments as being a part of a vibrant Solomonic tradition?
Yeah, for sure. So in Liber Iuratus, we do have that whistle, and I want to write a whole other article about the Grammaric whistle traditions, which are very rich too. And yes, as you pointed out, there's that 7-sided aspect, and you notice that Aaron used 7 bells connected to his trumpet. And of course, the connections between 7 go to the 7 planets. They go to the 7 archangels who stand before the throne. You can make connections to the arbitel spirits, those 7 planetary spirits. And so all of those options are open to you depending on how you want to employ the bells, or use the whistle, or use the trumpet. For example, in the Bell of Girardius, which is used in another grimoire, which is much later, it has the sigils of the 7 planets on it. So again, we have that reoccurrence of the 7 theme. But if you look at the Hygromantean bell or the Key of Solomon's bell of art, there's not as much emphasis on the 7 aspect. But it's there. It's available in the tradition if people want to explore that. So for me, what the bell adds to the ritual space is that it helps with setting the mood. It helps with placing you in a state where you're ready to do magic. It creates a sense of being in an altered space, a different space. The word holy in the Bible is used for something set apart. If you look at the grimoires, like the Key of Solomon, the magician is often instructed to go apart from society, to go into a hidden room, or go into a cave, or go into a field where people had died, that is away from the ordinary realm of mundane life. And I think that the bells also have a role, or the trumpets have a role in transporting you into that space so you can do the magic within it. And I think that you don't really get that as much if you only rely on the holy water or the suffumigations or the sprinkling. All of this, these are crucial aspects, but you can add on to it and enrich it even more by bringing in the auditory, musical, vibratory aspect that the bell or the trumpet gives you.
Frater S.C.F.V had a question for you about, when it comes to the bells and these sonorous instruments, he's curious as to what experiences, you've had, for example, using it, or noticed effects and results, sort of a before a bell and after a bell comparison, or if any spirits themselves directly commented on the effects. Can you just kind of, Adam, share just a little bit about that in terms of the noticed effects and kind of before and after?
For sure, yeah. So before I got into the bells and the trumpets, for years and years, I never used anything like that. The closest thing I had was the vibratory formula of the Golden Dawn when I was doing Golden Dawn work. And I'm kind of like Aaron Leach in that respect, where I keep the Golden Dawn work on one side and the Solomonic on another. I do a little bit of overlap, but I tend to do those things in parallel. But when I got into the bells and the trumpets, I found it created a big difference in my approach to magic. And many of the spirits do seem to really resonate with it differently. The archangels especially have encouraged me to use it. I think it's because it creates this harmony with their higher nature, like I pointed out before. So I've noticed that difference. And how I've used it, I've kind of combined the hygromantean practice of ringing the bell before you enter the circle to announce that you're entering the sacred space, then ringing it to the 4 quarters in the way that the Key of Solomon recommends. And that, by the way, is drawn from the Bible as well. And it's from Numbers, where Moses is instructed to create a silver trumpet and blow it to the 4 quarters to attract the tribes, to mobilize the 12 tribes of Israel to move out in the camp. So we're mobilizing the spirits to move out to us. And we're kind of putting ourselves in the footsteps of Moses when we do that within the Solomonic tradition. And it's nice to be able to draw on that rich vein of lore as well. So I think practically the spirits respond very well to it, especially celestial spirits and angels. But it's also very deeply grounded in this old tradition, walking through the footsteps of these great magicians or these great prophets. We find that as well in the PGM, where sometimes you'll stand and say, I am Moses, and you'll declare that identity. We're kind of walking through those steps a little more subtly when we're using the bell in this way, or the trumpet.
To that point, Adam, there is another really important article that you wrote regarding the mystic rods of power and the consecration of a Solomonic wand. And, of course, as anyone who has ever watched any Disney thing ever, wands are a part of pop culture, Harry Potter. One thinks of all of these kind of associations. But personally, I think the kind of historical actual use in a grimoire or a kind of cultural context of wands in terms of ritualistic magic is grossly misunderstood. And can you just kind of give the listeners, even though they may have used a wand or they have a wand, what are magical wands, and what do you think are the 2 or 3 big things that people don't understand on the outset about magical wands?
For sure. So the wand traditions are also very interesting, and they're also very ancient. Our English word magic comes from the Greek mageia, which the Greeks, like Plato in the Alcibiades, I believe it's chapter 1, around 122 or so, they refer to mageia, or the Magian lore of Zoroaster. And so in the Zoroastrian tradition is where we find the first, I believe, the first wands. There could be some other ones, but I know we have the Bearsman, or the Barsum, which was a prototype of the Greco-Egyptian singular wand. But unlike the one-piece unique wands we have in the PGM, the Bearsman was actually a bundle of twigs that were held together. They were cut from the tamarisk tree. And the Zoroastrian Magi used this as a ritual tool to channel divine power, to execute divination, and also to energetically communicate between different realms. They had a concept of the material, or the getig, and the spiritual, or the menog realm. And the Barsman would enable the magician to communicate between those domains. We find that as well in the Greek traditions. I mean, Strabo and Phoenix of Colophon, I believe this is 280 BC. They're cited in Athenaeus. They also recommend the use of wands. They were known to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and this is all thanks to Joseph Peterson, by the way. I'm heavily drawing on him here. He points out that the ancient Roman flamines, or fire priests, also carried these bundles of twigs in their hands. We have in Homer, in the Odyssey, I think it's chapter 11, there's a reference to Circe using the magical wand. We find it in Virgil as well. We find it in the Occult Philosophy, Book 1, Chapter 41. Eliphas Levi, who is, one of the great influences on the Golden Dawn tradition, he talks about it in the Key of the Mysteries, Part 4, Chapter 1. Again, in Betts as well. And I know Betts is often critiqued, but he's very on point here when he's drawing on the Greek and Demotic magical papyri. He gives examples of Greek spells that use wands. There's a branch of myrtle that's shaken to salute the goddess in PGM 142 to 195. And there's a similar example in PGM 222. Iamblichus, a great Neoplatonic magician, he talks about the use of the wand or a staff while invoking the divinity and mysteries of the Egyptians, chapter 7. So there's a lot of tradition here around this, and we have sometimes there's a unification of the staff and the wand where they're kind of used in the same way, or those are used as two things. Usually a wand is handheld. It's like the Harry Potter wand. It's about the length between your elbow and the tip of your finger. You can flick it, whereas the staff is more like Gandalf's great mighty staff, or Saint Cyprian of Antioch. He's shown holding this staff-like object. So in the grimoires, we find differing instructions for those two things. Sometimes there's only one of them recommended. Sometimes you find both, like in the Grimoire Verum. There's an elder wand and a hazel wand. The hazel wand instructions in the Verum are very similar to the hazel wand in the Key of Solomon. It's very similar. So how are wands used, or what I would say are the three biggest things to know about them, are, first of all, that they're used with the names and sigils of spirits upon them, so they're consecrated, or it could have divine names, like the Trithemius wand. And it's kind of like a lightning rod. The power of the divine is channeled towards it through that sympathetic connection between the names of power on the wand, or also the wood that it's made of, whether it's ebony, like the Trithemian wand, or hazel, like the Key of Solomon wand. the nature of those woods and their connection to different planets, which Agrippa talks about in great depth, is also important. The second thing is those wands can be used in divination. You can hold a wand while you're doing a tarot reading or when you're doing a geomancy reading or you're casting runes. And you can also use them while invoking spirits. When I'm working with archangels, I'll hold the wand. I don't brandish it at them and threaten them with it, but I'll hold it to kind of harmonize myself with their nature, which seems to facilitate scrying with them and communicating with them.
We will, of course, link to your article, and I would really encourage listeners to check out Adam's article on this and elsewhere. In the article, Adam, you mentioned kind of three basic points that you explore in the article. One is you lay out your approach to crafting a magical wand, and then you also talk a little bit about your research on the characters to be inscribed on the wand, and you also offer kind of a blueprint to have a ritual that you use to consecrate your own wand. So when it comes to your own approach to crafting a magical wand, like what are the basics to crafting a magical wand? What are some of the pitfalls? What are the things that people might be tempted to do but they should avoid? Like, from your experience, what should people keep in mind?
It depends on the nature of the wand you're making. So it depends on the grimoire you're working with as well. So if you're working with Trithemius, you're going to want to use ebony. If you're working with the Key of Solomon, you'll want to use hazel. Ideally, what you want to do is find somebody who's going to cut this wand for you in the day and hour of the planet when it's supposed to be done. For example, Mercury for the Key of Solomon. There's also a wand in the Grimoire Verum that I believe is cut in the day and hour of the sun. There are apps that help with figuring out the planetary hours, and they're very useful. I highly recommend that. So what you want to do is at first identify the type of wand you're going to use. So mine, for example, was made from hazel because I was working with the Key of Solomon. And it was cut in the day and hour of the planet. It was actually sent to me by a friend named Sharif, so thank you, Sharif, for that. So you want to ideally follow the instructions as closely as possible to the grimoire. I think one thing to avoid is to avoid cutting corners whenever you can. And I agree with Frater S.C.F.V on this. He's 100% on point, that whatever you can follow the grimoire, it's good to do so because we don't know everything about these traditions. These are broken traditions, as Dr. Skinner says, that we have a lot of missing information. So whenever we can be close to the grimoires, I think that's very helpful. I painted my hazelwood white because I like the look of it, but I also mixed Solomonic holy water into the paint to kind of add one level of empowerment and protection on it. I burned offerings of incense to God and to the angels while I was consecrating it during the hour of Mercury, on the day of Mercury. When the moon is waxing, that's also stipulated by the grimoire. And I did some praying and chanting as well. I inscribed it, again, with the characters on the day and hour of Mercury while the moon was waxing. I passed it through the consecrated Solomonic incense smoke and blessed it with Solomonic holy water and anointed it with Solomonic holy oil. So with all of these levels of consecration, it was empowered in that way. And the characters that I use on my wand, that I talk about this in the article a little bit, those are drawn from comparisons between a wide variety of manuscripts, mainly due to my friend Andy Foster, who really helped with this. He was very generous in sharing his own research on the characters. I kind of abstracted the core features across each character one at a time, and I used that final set of characters on my wand. And I think Aaron Leach did a similar approach in his Secrets of the Magical Grimoires, where he also gives a set of the characters.
Let me quote from your article here, because you also mention this kind of, and you lay out an integrative, multi-dimensional ritual that kind of incorporates and weaves beautifully these different strands. And for you, this is, an incredibly powerful and effective way to go through the ritual. So can you, just for the listeners, Adam, give us kind of a broad overview in terms of once someone has consecrated it, and you put the characters on, you've inscribed it to your specifications and those of the grimoires, what is kind of the ritual? What's like the next step?
For sure. So like I was mentioning before, the magical traditions in the West are a broken technology. We're trying to put the pieces back together after these arts were lost for centuries of time, largely due to church persecution and the rise of the scientific materialism, or we might say unscientific materialism, because it's founded on a set of assumptions that can't be empirically verified. So because of that, we've lost touch with a lot of the different magical technologies. And my approach when I was kind of preparing this ritual for use in consecrating my own wand was to go back through the different grimoires that have something to say about how we should consecrate a wand. What are the different consecrational formulae that are presented in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, in the 4th book of occult philosophy, in the Key of Solomon, and also I looked at the Grimoirium Verum and the Grand Grimoire as well, which all have something to say about this. And I kind of took the key invocations and kept the divine names exactly as described in the grimoires and put them together with the use of psalms, which is also recommended in the texts. And together that creates this beautiful ritual where there's psalms recited, there's invocations of divine names, of archangels, of angels, of spirits. They're all being present to summon and provide their energy and empowerment and bless this wand so that it can be used in the art. So that's kind of how I approached putting that together. The whole article provides that ritual in full. So if people want to practice that, it's all there for you.
When it comes to consecration itself, you wrote another blog post that I'd love to get into, which is called, and I love this word, I really hope you trademark this word, it's cryptoconsecratio, and it is so cool. And so the name of your article, I should say, is Cryptoconsecratio, Reflections on the Magical Consecration by Mass in the Solomonic Grimoires. And just like you, I grew up Catholic. I was also steeped in kind of Islamic studies and Arabic. But one of the things that I'm so enchanted by is the concept of the Catholic Mass and kind of this, of course, theologically, this sacrifice, this kind of replication in real time of the sacrifice that Christ made on the cross, but also how all the grimoires talk about, or many grimoires talk about the holy sanctifying power for magical implements and for the operator of Mass. And so I want to get into what cryptoconsecratio means first, but why don't we just start from a broad view in terms of, Adam, what are your thoughts on the Catholic Mass in general in the Solomonic Grimoires, and why is that so important for people to pay attention to?
Definitely. So like I was pointing out before, what I'm trying to do with a lot of my work is to bring out these neglected aspects of the grimoires and to explain how we can apply them today, while also looking at them in historical context of the books themselves. So one of those things is the consecration by Mass, and this is a very interesting element of the Solomonic Grimoires. I kind of define it as the process of spiritually empowering or sanctifying either magicians themselves or magical objects through their presence in the formal performance of liturgical or votive Christian masses. But this same principle can be more broadly applied by, say, if you're a Buddhist, you could bring your tools to your Buddhist practice if you're going to a temple. You might have to hide them, and that's cryptoconsecratio, which I'll come back to, but you can still have them there present, or you could have them in a backpack when you go to the mosque, and being in the presence of the holy invocation will have a similar effect. Since I'm working within a Christian framework now, I follow the grimoires very closely on that as much as possible, and I'll point out how this is very difficult in some ways, depending on which text you're following. But in the article, I look at mainly 3 different texts that use this consecration by Mass. And one of those is the sworn book of Honorius, or Liber Juratis Honorii, allegedly written by Honorius of Thebes. It's mentioned in a 1347 trial record of Olivier Pepin from Mende, France. It's the most complete and reliable manuscript. Sloan 3854, I believe, is the most, which dates to the 14th century. And here we have consecration by Mass. But what's interesting is in this text, it's not the magical tools that are consecrated by Mass, but the magician themselves. The book instructs the magician to find a wary and a faithful priest who is willing to pray over the magician, a modified version of a votive Mass called the Mass of the Holy Ghost, or the Mass of the Holy Spirit. So the votive Masses are a different category of Masses from the standard liturgical Mass. So there is, for example, in some grimoires, they mention the Mass of the Virgin Mary or the Mass of the Holy Spirit. And these are not performed as much these days in the standard Catholic Church. They still are. If you need to do them as many times as the grimoires recommend, it can be a little tricky, and I'll talk about how to get around that later on. But for example, in Honorius, and again, this is not the same as what Joseph Peterson calls the ridiculous book of the grimoire of Pope Honorius. This is Liber Juratis I'm talking about. So in this text, so the magician goes to the Mass, and the priest who he's working with, or she is working with, recites the Mass over the magician. But there's there's interesting tweaks that are made to the Mass. So this is a modified Mass. It's a grimoiric Mass, I would say. The numbered prayers from the sworn book are actually integrated into the Mass itself by the priest who's performing it. The third, the fourth, the fifth, the seventh, and the eighth prayers that are all recited by this priest while consecrating the body of Christ. So this is during that key alchemical transubstantiation moment. These prayers from the grimoire are brought into the Mass. And at this most auspicious time, the priest prays that through the grace of God, the magician shall work to obtain the effects of their petition. So that's a magical act in a Christian Mass. So that's very interesting, coming back to our discussion of mysteries and magic and religion. Also in the sworn book, there's another passage that says, anybody who wishes to operate with the spirits is strictly warned to purify himself through ritual bathing, being garnished with all virtues, praying and confessing their sins, fasting with only bread and water, and attending the Mass of the Holy Ghost. But this time the magician is instructed to pray the prayers from the grimoire. This is 19 and 20. Pray for the success of the operation they're going to do. And when do they do it? They do it when the priest reveals the body of Christ to the congregation. So again, at that key moment, when there's this strong sense of occult virtue, of divine presence, that's when these prayers are made, to kind of infuse the magician with the power to be purified and prepared to do the operation. If you look at Sloane 3847, this is the clavicle of Solomon revealed by Ptolemy the Grecian. Again, we don't know if this was really Ptolemy the Grecian. It could be pseudo-Ptolemy, like we have pseudo-Agrippa writing the fourth book and so on. But this text is one of the earliest available manuscripts of the Key of Solomon. It dates to around 1572, I believe, according to Joseph Peterson. And in this text, the consecration by Mass is heavily used, and I mean heavily. So this is the old Key of Solomon text, okay? So people who work the Key of Solomon and aren't using the consecration by Mass, this is very interesting to look at. So in this, even when you're making the planetary pentacles from the Key of Solomon, the magician is supposed to have a priest perform 3 masses of the Holy Spirit and 1 of the Virgin Mary over the pentacle. And so look at the sheer volume of masses that are used in this text. It blew my mind. If you look at the tools, okay? So for consecrating the tools, there's supposed to be 3 masses said over the knife, which is conjured by the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So that's interesting about Sloane 3847. It's a very Christian form of the Key of Solomon. If you look at the later editions of the text, they cut out the Christian material to try to make it look older, to try to make it look more Jewish. But that element is very present in Sloane 3847. There's 3 masses for the virgin wax or the earth that's used in the candles or any images that are made. There's 3 masses to be said over the needle. There's 3 masses to be said over the virgin parchment. And there's a staggering 9 masses to be said over the silk cloth that's used to wrap the tools. So this is extremely important within that grimoire. So if you're going back to the oldest texts of the Key of Solomon proper, I'm just saying that to distinguish it from the Hygromantean texts, it's extremely prominent there. And we also find it in the Heptameron, or the magical elements of Peter de Abano, or probably pseudo Peter de Abano again, because he probably wasn't written by him. But it's an extremely influential grimoire from 1496. And here the magician's instructed to be clean and purified for 9 days before the operation, to be confessed, to receive communion. So we see this deeply Catholic aspect again. And also attend Mass. To receive communion, you have to attend Mass. But the magician also has to have holy water, a vesture, an earthen vessel, a garment, a book. And over the pentacle and the sword, they are both instructed to be consecrated by Mass, with 1 Mass of the Holy Ghost said over each of them. So the rationale kind of behind all of this is that we're purifying, we're sanctifying, and we're empowering either the magician or the tools to bring them into sympathetic harmony with the holy forces that we're working with.
My goodness, I didn't even, 9 masses.
9
masses. Talking about stuff. Okay, so that is like, here I think there might be some listeners who might be saying, well, gosh, getting up before sunrise on a day and hour of Mercury and consecrating salt is engaging enough, but 9 masses. That is just incredible. Okay, so you talk about practical suggestions for the contemporary practitioner with all this stuff about the importance of masses, and there's kind of 3 different areas that you offer to listeners to consider. And can you just kind of give us a brief overview on what are the 3 main options that are open to contemporary magicians if they are really looking for, okay, I know this needs to be consecrated by Mass. How do I do this? What are the 3 main options that you offer?
For sure. So we have at least 3 different approaches for if we want to use this technique. And I mean, the funny thing is that, I talked about my religious history and how I went through all these other traditions. When I got back into Solomonic magic, I started working with the Psalms, and then I felt this call to go back to church. So I did. So I started going to church every Sunday, and I still do. For me, it's very easy to do the consecrations by Mass, and I'll explain how I approach that. So, of course, one option is that you could follow Liber Iuratus, and you can find a faithful and wary priest who's willing to help you to follow the Liber Iuratus method exactly and put those prayers from the grimoires into the Mass and do that for you. That's if you're going to follow Liber Iuratus by the book and you have this faithful and wary priest, that's a good option. That's the first option. The second option, you can get ordained as a priest yourself and perform the Mass over your own instruments. That's a little more difficult because, of course, ordination, to go through that full process is a commitment. It's a long period of several years of study and preparation, but it can be done. I also want to give a shout out to Aaron Leach here. He has a service on Doc Solomon's where he'll actually consecrate objects by Mass for you, I believe for a donation. It's super kind of him to do that. So you can, if you check out his website and you want him to do it, he's a consecrated priest himself, a Gnostic priest, I believe. He has a service where he's willing to do that for you. So that's another option. And a third one is you can do what I do, which is crypto-consecratio. So this is clandestinely consecrating our implements in public. So as you can imagine, if you're going to a traditional church and you're bringing magical tools in, you naturally can't walk down the aisle brandishing a wand or a sword and expect that the congregation's going to have no problem with that. So what I do is I place the objects to be consecrated by Mass in a bag. I'll often use a backpack if they're fairly small, or if they're large, like a sword, you can use an instrument case, like a guitar case. And you'll bring the case or the bag into the church Mass. And at the key moments of the Mass, for example, at the transubstantiation, then you can say your prayers over the elements quietly. You'll place your hand over the bag or over the case containing your magical tools, and you'll say the prayers over at the key point as explained in the grimoires. And if you need to do it multiple times, you just go to multiple Masses, and you'll meet that requirement as given in the text. But this is crypto-consecratio. It's a secret form of consecration, which is, funny enough, done broadly and in public.
I love crypto-consecratio. I love how you lay this out. And so you kind of go on to talk about this, but can you share with us about, this is one of the options that you do. I mean, give us some tips, because you're right. Like if someone has a consecrated sword, for example, I mean, immediately I'm reading your article and I'm like, okay, I think I have an empty guitar case in the basement. So if I put the sword in the guitar case and then I pretend like this is just one of the instruments that the choir and kind of musically oriented people, maybe I can put this at the front of the Catholic Church. Like, I'm thinking of all of these things of like how to imbue this with occult virtue. Can you just share with us some of your experiences on that?
Right. So it depends on where you are in that church. I mean, if you're in the choir or you're in the band, you can bring your guitar case with you and just have it nearby while you're performing the music. If you're just a churchgoer, what I do is I bring it with me into the pews and I just have it there. I sit as close as I can to the front to maximize the occult virtue, as Agrippa would say. But I think you can sit anywhere in the church. It doesn't matter. It will still work. That's one way to do it. You can just have it with you in the pew, and then it's easy to take it out when you're leaving. And then before I went to church to do this, and after, I would perform at home with my holy water and my consecrated incense and the holy oil. I would do those consecrations and those prayers in my magical temple. And then I would just finish the consecrations within the church itself. So that's another way to do it.
Adam, that brings up not necessarily a fourth option, but it's something that I know authors like Dr. Joseph Lisusky in Ceremonial Magic and the Power of Evocation talks about, specifically walking readers through the Heptameron, which is he recommends that people can perform the votive Mass of the Holy Ghost by themselves, even though they're not a priest at all. They can get a Catholic Missal, they can go through the kind of first part of the Mass. And I know some people who do this who say, oh yeah, I needed to consecrate a kid's skin or a goat skin pentacle of Solomon or a sword, and so I performed this by myself. I guess, do you see that as a legitimate way to do it, or is there something, as you said, that kind of being in the presence of a pre-sanctified holy space, and really that kind of lineage of tradition, is that more important? How do you see that?
Yeah, the way I see that is, ideally you'd want to be a consecrated priest, because that's what the grimoires call for, and that there's something about being a consecrated priest that gives you an easier access to the occult virtue that Agrippa's talking about. It's, again, I'd rather that somebody practice the Mass themselves, even if they're not a consecrated priest, and do that aspect following the grimoire, than not do it at all. I think that's better. So in my article, I actually present the full text of the Mass of the Holy Ghost in Latin, if anyone wants to use it. So that's another option that's available there.
Have you noticed in your experience using English or other languages as opposed to like Latin or like more of the traditional languages in terms of the European grimoire context? Or do you find that in your spiritual operations, the spirits kind of resonate regardless of the actual language?
That's a great question. I was thinking about this too in relation to the PGM. So if you look at the PGM, when those magicians were invoking spirits using divine names or spirit names in Egyptian or from Hebrew sources or from Christian sources, they were very careful, and Dr. Skinner points this out in his books, they were very careful to write the exact pronunciation of those words in terms of like transliterations, so the magician could pronounce those properly and in the original languages. But if you look around that, when they're performing their rituals, they were speaking in Greek. So they were speaking in their language. So my view is that there's virtue and value in using a Latin version of a text. You can do that. I know people who do that. But for me, what's most important is that the divine names and the spirit names be pronounced in their original language as closely as possible to how they were originally said. The rest of the text can be said in your own language, and I've had no problem with that. The spirits will speak to you in your own language. They'll use your own memory and mobilize that knowledge you have. So for example, if you work with a spirit, they're not going to speak to you in Egyptian hieroglyphics if you don't know Egyptian hieroglyphics. They'll speak to you in your own language. And you can request that. If a spirit starts talking to you in a language you don't know, you could say, can you please, I give you access to my memory to speak to me in my own language in words clear and intelligible to me. So that's how I approach that aspect.
What was like one of your first experiences that you ever had in terms of magical success with a grimoire or a Western grimoire tradition? What was kind of one of your first experiences? And then the second question would be like, how do you practice day to day? How do you practice in terms of specific rituals? Is there anything that you can share for your current practice?
Yeah, sure. So I don't know if I had many great successes when I started out. I had some great failures, in fact, and I had some very awkward moments where I was in the temple and I forgot to write down a certain invocation that I had written, and I was already in the circle and the ritual was going, so I had to ad-lib it, or I knocked things over, or I dropped things. I've had a lot of those blunders, so I'm very humble about my own experience. I'm not a great master adept, I fall prey to these things too. But some of the things that have really stood out to me, working with Archangel Raphael, I was extremely sick one day and I worked with him. I used the Heptameron invocation to invoke him into my circle using all my Solomonic instruments. I asked him to heal me, and within a day and a half, my cold was entirely gone. So that was a thing that showed me, wow, there's something to this. I mean, normally it takes me 7 days to get over a cold. I've had those kinds of things happen very often, and I've heard sounds in the room during invocations or evocations like knocks, or I've heard groans, mysterious groans, or I've had objects fall to the floor in other rooms or those kinds of things. So those things do happen, and they're very interesting. So if you're purely a psychological model type person, those things are very hard to explain. And in terms of my normal practice, so I work with the Golden Dawn Order, which I help run, and we founded 8 years ago. We're still going strong. So that's a nice thing about that. I can't really talk about much of what we do, but it's traditional Golden Dawn system. So I practice that. In parallel, I do my Solomonic work. So there I'm working mainly with the Key of Solomon tradition. So that's a big aspect of what I do. But I also do kind of folk magic with the Cyprianic tradition. So working with Saint Cyprian, I did a 9-day series of rituals, a novena that was dedicated to him and taking him on as my patron. I invoked 8 archangels 8 days in a row and spoke with them all, mainly about what I could do better to serve other people, how I could learn more about what they specialized in. For example, with Cassiel, he talked to me a lot about discipline and the power of binding, and how we have this bias. As he said, you humans have this bias against discipline, and you think that it prohibits or kind of disrupts your sense of freedom, but it's the opposite. There can be no freedom of manifestation without limits imposed on something, because something cannot have a form without being constrained into that form. So anything we want to manifest as an expression of freedom has to have this limitation aspect that enables it to come out. So this is the kind of thing that when you talk with spirits, they'll teach you things you didn't know, which is very interesting. And that was a very powerful experience that I had.
When it comes to kind of a spiritual focus, do you use a crystal sphere? Do you use some other kind of focus? Or is it just something outside of the circle as the incense is going? Or can you share a little bit about that?
So I was notoriously very bad at scrying. I remember times where I stared into a crystal ball for 4 hours and nothing happened. So I really wanted to experiment, and that was actually one of the foci of that 9-day ritual, was improving my scrying abilities. I've tried all kinds of things. I've tried crystal balls, I've done PGM lacanomancy, which works quite well. I tried to do hybrid methods that I've never seen anyone do. Like, what if I put the crystal ball in a bowl of water with candles floating around it? Does that work better? And that didn't work so well for me, at least, but I tried it. I like this element of experimentation within traditionalism. I think those two things can come together very nicely. What the Archangel Raphael showed me was that you can make a candle offering to a spirit, and I will dress that candle with appropriate oils and spices and herbs that resonate with the occult virtue of that particular spirit. I place that offering candle behind the crystal ball so that the flickering of the light comes through the crystal, and then I'll scry into that. And that seems to be what works best for me with archangels. So ever since, I've been using that.
Trust me, I am in that club when it comes to scrying and spending many, many hours in front of a dark obsidian mirror or a crystal ball and just wondering, like, am I just a complete failure at this? Like, I don't, that was years ago, but still, like, and that kind of goes to the point of another question, which I remember speaking with Frater Chasson and his scryer, Ben McStefan, and how Frater obviously has an entire chapter in his first book on working with a scryer and the importance of, like, you as the magician are the operator, but having someone who has that kind of third eye sight, so to speak, or that kind of natural resonance or inclination to perceive the spirits is really important. And I'm wondering, Adam, like, do you engage with a scryer at all, or do you work at all in terms of grimoire traditions with other people, or are you more of kind of like a solitary practitioner?
So when I do Golden Dawn work, I mainly work in a group. We have a full temple. But when I do Solomonic work, I'm very much like Jake Stratton-Kent, or I think Dr. Skinner. Most of the time he works alone. I work alone. I do my own scrying. I do my own conjurations. I can encourage people that even if you've had a lot of difficulty with scrying, it can be developed and it can be improved. And you can ask spirits to help you with that. And they really did for me. I mean, I remember some of my first invocations where I would invoke an archangel. I would feel their presence when they appeared, but I could only get one image or one word or a 3-word phrase from them. And there was other times where I was having difficulty tuning into the spirit. So I remember an invocation of Mikhail. I was getting his presence kind of like fuzzy, and then it would go clear, and then it would be... I was having trouble getting this clear message from him. It took time to figure out how I was going to tune into him and be able to speak with him more clearly. So that can happen as well. But there can be development of scrying ability. Some people are born experts of scrying for whatever reason. I'm sure that Frater Chasson's scryer is amazing, and I think he has that natural ability. I think he said he always has had that, right? He was born with it, or he developed it very early on, and it just carried with him. Whereas other people can have a lot of difficulty with that. What I think is it's best to just stick with it and don't give up if you have some failures. Try to learn from them. And I like this phrase from NLP, there's no such thing as failure, only feedback. So try to get feedback from what doesn't work or what does work, and then just bring that forward, and then there will be a progression in the practice.
Can you just talk about, like, how you pick and use and kind of meld together in this kind of resonance way different traditions. For example, you mentioned Raphael, and if someone goes through the Heptameron, I mean, one of the interesting things about those conjurations is they're very open-ended. I mean, of course, they all start out, conjuro et confermo super vos angele fortis, etc. But then at the end it says, enter your petition here. Like, then you must say it. Even though it's part of a specific, like, Heptameron grimoire, there's this, like, urging to use it in very open-ended ways. Can you just talk about that?
I think there's an element of pre-given structure that's given in the grimoires, and the structures work very well. And I think Dr. Skinner has done an amazing job of pointing out the traditional steps, that there's like a technique of Solomonic magic that it goes through these various stages of, welcoming the spirit, binding them, and engaging in a petition. I mean, it depends on your approach with the spirits. Mainly, I tend to work through offerings and through making requests and promising offerings in return. I don't do as much of the binding work of like the aggressive kind that we find in some of the PGM rituals or some of the Solomonic rituals. I like the invocation and offering kind of approach that you find in the last chapter of the Key of Solomon. So the nice thing about the Key of Solomon is it gives you an option. You have the exorcistic approach of hard-handedness that comes through most of the text, where you have threats to the spirit, and if they don't obey, you'll do this to them. Again, that's very old. The ancient Egyptian magicians did that. It's in the PGM. We've seen ancient Egyptian texts working with ancestor spirits that said, which combine these two things in very interesting ways. I remember this one spell that said, if you do this for me, O ancestral spirit, I will give you great offerings, and I will keep your temple clean, and I will honor you every day. And if you don't do it, I will stop all offerings, I will dirty your temple, I won't do anything for you, and no one will remember you.
Wow.
So these are very old, the two traditions. And Jake Stratton Kent does an amazing job of explaining the older archaic Goetia tradition, and very much based in offerings and contracts and working. And I think binding is a term that gets a lot of flack because we think of it as very harsh, but that's only one form of binding. A contract, even in our ordinary life, we talk about legal contracts. They're legally binding, but they're agreements. They're just agreements that have some kind of force behind them to enforce them. So that's how I like to work with spirits, is I'll make this contract of an agreement that if you do this for me, then I'll do this for you, and it's reciprocal. And I think their spirits tend to respond well to that, and if you're working in long-term relationships with spirits, that's a very useful way to approach. I know Aaron Leach also does that, and it works really well. It's also what Jake Stratton Kent recommends.
And that reminds me when John King was on the podcast talking about his grimoire work and writing imperial arts, about if you have a contractor who's doing work on your house, well, you can pay the contractor with a beer if you want, which is great, like a case of beer, let's say. But if the house burns down or if there's a problem, there's no legally binding contract. Or you can pay the contractor with like a specific agreement, which, to your point, isn't berating the contractor. It's not saying, you will do this or 1,000 deaths upon you in the 7 hells, but it's more of just saying like, hey, there's this agreement. So as opposed to just offering a bunch of things without any parameters whatsoever. Is that somewhat fair in terms of kind of what you were discussing?
Yeah, exactly. So when you're working with archangels, you can threaten them all you want, but they're infinitely more powerful than you. So it doesn't work that well for me in terms of archangels. It might be different with different kinds of spirits. There could be different approaches. So I'm not all offerings and petitions only and no forceful approach, or the other way. I'm not extremist in these two ways. It depends on what you're doing. But with archangels, it's more like I establish a relationship, almost like a friendship, knowing that they have much more power, where I'm giving them gifts. For me, offerings are like a gift you would give to a friend because you care about them and you're grateful for them. You build that relationship. You want to help them out, they want to help you out, and it's kind of reciprocal in that way. So, yeah, I really like John King's analogy there. It's spot on.
Where do you think magic is heading globally and also in the Western grimoire tradition? Like you mentioned, it's a broken technology. Do you think that those pieces could be resurrected and fused back together? Just what are your overall thoughts?
We're very, very lucky. We live in a golden age of access to magical texts. We don't have to steal them from libraries. We don't have to dig them up in tombs. We have the internet, which is more and more becoming a kind of collective mind of which we're all neurons, and we're contributing information to it, and we're thinking as a collectivity more and more. And I think that's going to evolve as we have AI technology and so on that's developing. I see more integration coming in our future, both in the mundane aspects of technological development and the way we operate our political structures, our social relations, but also in the magical world. I think we're seeing that a lot more. We have a lot of people from disparate traditions who were previously working in isolation, and now we're talking to each other. And this can be very interesting. One of my friends told me that she was recently speaking with a traditional Japanese magician. She was explaining some of the grimoiric methods from the Western tradition, and he was shocked at how there were great overlaps with this secret tradition that was only passed on to initiates, was not widespread, is not shared in public books, that were very similar to what we do with the grimoires, with circles, with wands and swords and conjurations and offerings. All these Solomonic staples were there in that old Japanese tradition. We're going to learn about more and more things like this, and I think we're sharing best practices from different traditions. And you have these very interesting blends that are happening, a greater openness around this. And I think there's also a disillusionment with the unscientific materialism model, material reductionism. A lot of people are saying, well, we threw out the baby with the bathwater on that one. The advances in physics and chemistry are so interesting, and I'm a great student of science too. I love the sciences. But at the same time, we've seen that we had these thousands of years old spirit traditions which were cast out with the rise of materialism. There's a disillusionment with that. It's in the wake of the postmodern revolutions, and now we're moving into an integral phase. We're moving beyond, I think, classical black or white thinking with regards to traditions, or arguing against science, or those two clashing with one another, or postmodernism leveling the playing field and negating everybody. I think we're moving into an integral phase where we're looking back and we're seeing the value in the sciences, we're seeing the value in the spirit traditions, we're seeing the value in different forms of philosophy, and it's coming together through a technologically mediated interface of the World Wide Web. And just look at the groups that we have now on Facebook, the Solomonic group for Aaron Leach, where I'm a moderator, and look at all the wisdom that was previously so spread out 10 years ago, where I was working with John R. King at Occult Corpus. We were moderators there in the ceremonial magic tradition. We had a forum, but there weren't Facebook groups or so on. It wasn't so easy for us to come together. And before that, I only was working out of old books that I'd found in libraries, and I had no one to talk to about this stuff. So that's only within 10 years. There's been a tremendous growth and evolution through those different things. And I think that's going to continue. We're going to move beyond this siloing approach where we're working in isolation, or we're clinging to this way only and not that way. And Jason Miller is doing amazing work on this as well. He's really bringing things together in different traditions, and he's promoting really integral views. I think he's writing a series of blog posts now where he's kind of contrasting these two opposite views on various issues and kind of saying, hey, there's a middle way between that where we don't have to throw out both partial truths. We can bring them together in these interesting ways. And I love that. I think that we're going to see more and more of that as the time goes on.
Do you feel that the gates are just starting to kind of peek open a little bit? Or it just seems like it's an exciting time right now?
Absolutely. Yeah, I do think the gates are opening, and we're seeing more and more of a intercultural dialogue and intertradition dialogues, which are really interesting because we can see overlaps and we can see differences and similarities. And I think that is going to continue. There's no reason to go back to isolating ourselves when we live in this very interconnected time. And I think there's also the element of magic being used to better human life. I think that return to a kind of cunning folk ethos is happening. I really love Rufus Ophis is doing amazing work on this. He's encouraging people to really develop themselves and to be more moral and more virtuous in their work. And he would say, don't treat people like shit. But I think
of course he would.
He's absolutely right. Yeah, we should use magic to pursue greater wisdom and greater compassion and greater concrete service of people. I mean, I work with older adults with dementia and with severe mental illness, and I've taught children and adolescents in the past, and I think that kind of service work is often marginalized in magic. We don't talk about it as much. We talk about me getting results for me, but we don't talk as much about serving the larger me that includes everybody.
Something, Adam, that I always want to make sure to ask guests who come on the podcast is, what are your 2 or 3 big tips for listeners out there who have heard this conversation and they hear what you have to say and they really want to get started or they really want to progress? Like, what are 2 or 3 of the biggest kind of Adam Pearsonian axioms that you might have for them to really push through? And then to kind of ask the flip side of that, what are 2 or 3 things that they should definitely, no matter what they do, they should not do? Like, what kind of advice do you have for everyone out there?
The first thing I would say is that it's very valuable to do a broad survey of what's available. People who want to get into grimoires, they should definitely read Aaron Leach's Secrets of the Magical Grimoires, which gives an overview of the grimoire tradition and the different aspects of the different texts and kind of helps you to orient yourself to a text that you might feel most called to. I think one of the dangers that I would say I would encourage people to avoid is to get totally drowned in too many traditions at once, to try to do too many things at once. I think if you could focus in on 1 or 2 texts that you really connect with and dive deep into those, then you'll get the most rapid results rather than continually postponing or being sidelined by trying to do too much at one time. And I think that's what we see a lot of. With my own magical practice, when I really focused in, I said, okay, I'm going to do my Golden Dawn stuff, and I'm going to do Solomonic. More specifically, I'm going to mainly work with the Key of Solomon. When I decided that, and then I started to work through the text, I made a lot more progress. When you focus on one text, you'll get curious about different aspects, and then you'll do research on those and find out the cultural background or the spiritual traditions or the historical aspects that undergird that. And that's very fun to dive into. That's where a lot of my research comes from. But the other thing that I would say is to start small. Start with very small, simple things when you're working with a text. Like when you're working with the Key of Solomon, it can be extremely overwhelming when you look at all these tools that need to be made and all these things that have to be consecrated, and you're like, where do I start? Well, the best thing to do is to work backwards, to see, okay, eventually when I'm doing the wand or something, I'm going to need some holy water, some consecrated incense. Some of the tools call for a holy oil to anoint, so I'll have to create those. So start with those, and then you make that simple. I'm going to just do the holy water. So I'm just going to ignore everything else in the text, look at the holy water. How do I make the Solomonic holy water? Get the tools you need to do that, make the water. Then you go to the next thing. Okay, how do I do the incense? You go through the process, you make the incense. From there, I went to making the circle. And when you're doing the circle, I wrote a whole article on crafting the circle, which can be really helpful, I think, to people because I corrected a lot of the mistakes in the Hebrew that we had in Mathers, working with another great source, my friend Gilberto Strapazzone. He did a lot of work on correcting the Hebrew, and I built on that a little bit. So that's all available. So we've saved people a lot of time from having to go through all the manuscripts and do that kind of work. That's already done. It's available there for you. And I also, in that article, Crafting a Solomonic Circle, I explained the steps, step by step, how do you go about making the circle. And really, you're only doing one pen stroke or one paint stroke at a time. So you just focus on the next line you have to draw. And if you just stick with it, before you know it, you'll have a full circle in front of you if you're working with a permanent circle. If you're working with the earth and you're using a sword to trace circles in the ground, you don't have to make a permanent circle. But it depends how you want to approach it. And another thing I would encourage people is to not think that the process of making the tools is a delay to doing the magic. What I would say is that when you're making the tools, that is a form of the magic, especially in the Solomonic tradition. What we do a lot of the time is consecrating and crafting the tools. We put so much effort into that and so much love into that. And that's what I think it should be. It's a devotional process. If you look at my Crafting Circles article, I talk about how I made it into a devotional process. So for me, it was a 3-week process to create that circle. And I was always burning incense and I was praying while I was painting it. I was doing offerings. And for me, that was a form of magic. That was just creating the tool. And I think if people take this devotional attitude to making the tools and just see what they can do, I think people are capable of a lot more than they think. My Hebrew wasn't very good when I started drawing my circle, but it developed a lot in the process because I had to draw so many Hebrew letters. And there's tools for making that easier. You can just draw little outlines of the letters and then fill them in. That's a very easy way to do that I learned from my friend Curtis. So that's another process that you can just take it step by step, one thing at a time, make your goals very small. I'm just going to create the circle. I'm just going to create the tools. And you do that one at a time. You work through them. And before you know it, you'll have everything you need and you'll be able to get to the practical work. And then it's really just struggling through it at first, making a lot of mistakes like I did. The spirits will help you and they'll teach you and you'll improve as you go. And also you'll gain experience and you'll know what works for you and what doesn't work. But I think for anyone who's called to this path, and I think you do have to be called to it because it's a lot of work, but it's amazing. It's beautiful and it's transformative of our lives. And I think that is very interesting and powerful aspect about it. It's an extension of your ordinary life and it transforms your ordinary life. And if you're committed to it, you take it a little bit at a time, you enjoy the journey, don't focus so much on the end result, then you're going to have an amazing adventure in magic.
To that point, Adam, can you share with listeners about where they can find you? Can you talk about your blog a little bit, which of course we will link to, but where can people find you and where can they go if they have questions or additional follow-ups or just want to learn more?
So if people want to contact me, my name's Adam Pearson. I can be reached by Facebook most easily. I'm a moderator in the Solomonic group, and I'm in a lot of the other occult groups, so you can easily find me in there. You can send me a private message if you want. If you have a question or something, I'm happy to help people as much as I can. In my busy schedule, working 3 jobs and finishing my clinical social work courses and so on, but I'll try to get back to you when I can. My blog is lightinextension.wordpress.com. And on there, I share my Solomonic work, some of my Golden Dawn processes, and my Cyprianic work as well. So those 3 traditions that I work within, there's aspects of that where I kind of share some of my techniques. When I have permission from spirits to share an interaction I had, I'll also do that. So you'll find some of that on there as well. What I really try to do with these articles is to make things easier for people. I try to draw on what I learned going through the hard processes of doing the research and struggling through these things and simplify and optimize as much as possible and kind of share the outcome so that people can start with that and save a lot of time, make it a lot easier for themselves. So that if people want to gain more insight into the Solomonic grimoires and some of the tools and how to go about doing that kind of thing, my articles are available there to help you.
Adam J. Pearson, on that note, cannot thank you enough just for coming on the podcast and taking the time out of your very busy schedule, and we definitely hope to have you back on again soon.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
How cool is that, listeners, to check out what Adam Pearson had to share about Solomonic bells, wands, and crypto consecratio. I will certainly never think of a backpack or a guitar case the same way ever again. So thanks as always to our awesome guests and to you, the listeners, for always kicking butt and sharing your time to enjoy the podcast. In the meantime, you can subscribe and check out previous episodes and other magical Glitch Bottle news on YouTube, youtube.com/glitchbottle, and you can, of course, download and listen to podcast episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. Please also make sure to subscribe and follow us on YouTube, and if you do subscribe, make sure to hit that little notification bell for new episodes as soon as they post. And also make sure to follow us on Twitter @GlitchBottle, all one word. Our intro music is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. Until next time, this is Alexander F. reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.